Good evening. Welcome to another episode of The Rebel Preacher. And today we're going to talk about terminology, understanding. We're going to use Dr. James Tabor in his book. Actually, he's just doing an interview on his book. But we're going to be talking about the concepts of the terminology, especially in the first century, of things that we need to understand. And again, I'm not here telling you this is truth and dogma, then you need to follow this. It's just an interesting investigation that we need to look at, because I think things have been twisted and manipulated, as it seems things in the world are always twisted and manipulated, to bring out doctrine and stuff that probably was never meant to be brought out. Now, first thing I want to say is this. If you go back to the first century times, the term Kabbalah was not a widely, if all, used term at all. I mean, there was secret, we know that Kabbalah in the way we understand it was around. We know that it was practiced in many different schools. We know the Essenes, we know, and that's another term too. If you use the word Essene, that was not used in the first century. Gnosticism was not used in the first century. These groups around during that time were like initiation schools within Judaism, within Greek culture, within Samaria. All cultures had higher levels of understanding, higher levels of learning above the normal ways of life. In other words, when people today look at the term Judaism, well, most people today see Judaism as Orthodox, conservative, Reform, and then you have your other liberal branches. But then when they, some people in their concept of Orthodox think of the, guys wearing the black suits with the black hat, heretic forms of Judaism. And they don't understand that there are Orthodox who don't do that. Some see Orthodox as those who wear their piotes out, their tzitzits out, the little strand, the strings outside their shirts, and don't realize that a lot of Orthodox don't do that. Conservative and Orthodox have nothing to do with each other, really. I mean, conservative and Reform don't even actually believe the Torah is from Sinai, where the Orthodox do believe it's from Sinai. And I'm not taking sides on any of this. As you know, I'm against doctrine. But I'm trying to give you an explanation of terminology is very important. Gnosticism would not have been understood at all till much later. We start reading the 300s and 400s is when the terminology really came into understanding. We had the schools of Seth. We had different schools of what we call Gnosticism today that were not with each other, did not agree with each other. And even if you read the Hammadi library, those books do not agree all with each other, because you have different sects of understanding of the gnosis. The gnosis, and gnosis is not a religious experiment or religious work or religious organization. Gnosis means understanding. So when you study the Zohar, you're getting the gnosis of understanding of what the Kabbalists are trying to teach you. When you read the Torah, the Tanakh, the New Testament, the Quran, you're trying to understand what the gnosis of that book is to help you change your life. So I want to start this video off stating that, because as a friend of mine mentioned one time in one of my comments, terminology means everything. So in this video, I am not promoting Gnosticism as today modern understanding. I'm not identifying Kabbalah in the way many normal people understand it, or nothing. Judaism, nothing the way today was the way it was back then. Christianity for sure was nothing as it was today. As we know from before the Council of Nicaea, there were so many different strands of Christianity, from Valentinism to, Rome hadn't actually started, but we had the Orthodox that they call themselves today. We had Marcion, we had so many different types of Christianity that did not call themselves Gnostic, that wound up being labeled Gnostic much later on. And it wasn't until Constantine's council that they created what we know today and developed into the church today. The doctrines of the Trinity were not there. As a matter of fact, you read what the early church fathers, and I'm talking about first, second century church fathers, said about Trinity. It's nothing of what we had today. The whole thing of Jesus being God was a much later invention. The Ebionites, who we know are one of the earlier brands of Christianity, did not believe that. Some of the Nazarite which, Nazarene, which is not a good terminology, which was not known as that back then, either the Ebionite, didn't believe that either. It was a much developed later on work of the Orthodox and other people who created the doctrines of Christianity today. The same with Judaism. Back in the day, Judaism did not have a 13 dogma of belief that they have today. And really, most Orthodox don't believe in the 13, although they have to because Rambam said so. Many of them don't believe that. There was no resurrection from the dead. There was no Mashiach figure in the early Judaism. Early Judaism was not monotheistic as it's supposed to be today. They had plethoras of God. I mean, if you study the Zohar, you understand. You see the later figures of Lilith in there. You see a lot of other gods in there. So Judaism was not monotheistic as we see it today. I mean, they had other gods. If you read the Old Testament, it's not hard to see that they came on bringing. And Judaism, the Jews were from Canaanite. They were Canaanites. And I know the Canaanites in the Torah are victimized as being pagans, and which that term wasn't used either. But they were the bad people. But Jews were just that. They were just from that region and worshiped the same gods. And then if you study the whole story of Yahweh and El, and you see the different understandings of these gods, and Asherah, who was actually the female version of God for them back then. It wasn't a place. It was a female version of God. What I'm saying is when you unpackage this, you see a whole different concept of religion back in those days than we do today. They didn't just live the life that we live today, where you wash your hands before you eat bread and all of this stuff. I'm not saying it didn't exist. I'm just saying Judaism was a religion that was taught through tradition, not through school. The books, the Old Testament that we have today was created by the Christians to basically certify that Jesus was the Messiah. I mean, they picked the books. I mean, there was some books that they knew were common, but if you read the whole saga of Samuel, the whole Kings and First King, there was so many different books that they combined to make it compact to well, back then it was 77 books, but now it's 66 books. And the Jews didn't have a canon at that time. We don't know what all they had. We know they had the Torah per se, but we don't know what the prophets and everything that they were reading at the time. That was a much later invention. And then we have to skip out the whole thing of the books of Enoch, which was highly influenced in first century. It's all in the New Testament. It's all within the Dead Sea Scroll community of there. It's all there. Melchizedek is not in normal Judaism, but it's all over the day. So what I'm saying, terminology is so important when we talk about truth, because if you're looking at truth through the lens of modern Judaism, modern Christianity, modern Islam, you're already at a bad disadvantage. Now, I'm not saying if you believe these things, you have to unbelieve them. I'm just saying to give an honest prospect of what happened in the first century, you have to break off the levels of this onion to truly understand. Now, after all of that, after breaking out all of that, I need to get to the point now of what I'm talking about. Now, this interview with Dr. Tabor is very interesting because many today try to believe, when you look at Jesus, James, and Paul, the three pillars of the early doctrines that we believe now. First of all, the early Jesus, and I'm just going to say this, there's no, except outside the Gospels and a few other writings, there's no really historical evidence of a Jesus actually living. Now, you say, well, we have Talmudic. Yeah, you have Yeshu. And I'm not trying to say that Jesus didn't exist. I'm just trying to say that there's no historic, but really, again, there's no historical belief that Muhammad actually lived. There's no historic belief that Moshe actually lived. These are all beliefs. We have no real evidence of this. So it's nothing unusual. So I'm not trying to put Christians down. And then when you look at the works of the Gospels and then of James, and then you look at the letters of Paul, you really have to do some mix matching to make it work. And the church really does. And the church today has to really rely more on the teachings of James than they do of really Peter and James, because Peter and James tend to go more back to the Jewish of that time understanding of things, where Paul seems to be bringing on a new concept. Now, I'm not bashing Paul here. So I'm just giving you some understanding that I get out of what this interview is talking about. And it really makes sense once you hear it. Paul was, according to his words, a Pharisee of the Pharisee. He would, according to him, he studied under Gabriel. I don't know if that's true or not. We don't have a way to prove it. But we see that Paul was definitely something within the temple working for the priest, the Sanhedrin at the time, because in Acts we see where he gets permission to go chase these Christians and stuff. And something, according to Paul's words, which is two different stories, but all right, we'll give him the benefit of the doubt. In Acts, he says Acts is told one story, and in his words, another story is told. But something happened to him, and he had a enlightening experience, a very spiritual experience happened to him. And another interesting thing about Paul is he never brings up anything historically about the man Jesus. We don't hear nothing about his mother. He don't talk about the virgin birth, but he does talk about, being crucified, raised and all this kind of stuff. But all of the main things, it's like there's nothing, like he knows nothing at all about the man Jesus and his history. He just knows the spiritual stories. He was probably inspired by what he's been hearing, because back in those days, that was the internet of people talking about the great miracles and great things. And by the way, Jesus was not the only miracle worker at this time. If you Google and look at the many different miracle workers at this time, you see it was a word at that time. There was many people. But Jesus' popularity to Paul, he probably heard all the stories. He probably heard all the myths and everything about what Jesus supposedly did, or if he did. I'm not saying he did or not. So Paul was influenced by these stories, and something happened to him on the road to Damascus, like I said, according to his words and the writer of Acts, which they don't match, but okay, we'll give it the benefit of the doubt. And they, heard the voice, and, and this, Jesus said, why are you persecuting me? Why are you doing this? And he was blinded. And it says that later on, somebody came along and baptized or washed Paul, and then Paul was able to see. He had a revelation, spiritual revelation of this Christ, this Christos. And from that moment on, Paul's message had radically changed to the point that even I don't believe James and Peter ever trusted Paul. I don't believe they ever did, because their messages were so radical that James was based upon the Torah. Peter pretty much based upon the Torah. And then all of a sudden, Paul's coming out here with some way different doctrine that goes against, really don't go against, but probably goes to different schools that they're not used to hearing. So we see this happening. And then all of a sudden, we see Paul's message. And now today, 2,000 years later, we demonize Paul because we say Paul created Christianity as it is today, and it's nothing. Even Paul's words are nothing as it is today. And I will say that even Paul's words within his letters were changed to fit the narrative of Christianity, probably 1,000, 1,300 years, because you've got to remember, the written words were kept by the priests and the scribes. The common person did not read. I mean, even if you watch the old movie, if you watch these shows like the Game of Thrones, The Last Kingdom, Rome, you watch all of these old documentaries, and I know it's Hollywood, but the basic understanding's there. The common person could not read. The common Roman soldier could not read. So to be able to control the text, to be able to control the writing, the only thing you had to fool was the priests and the sages. And if they were in agreement, why not change it for the benefit of for their goal long term? Christianity was an evolving religion that changed through the years to where it is today. Paul would not even recognize the Baptist Pentecostal church today. I don't believe they would recognize what goes on in a lot of these places. So the church has grown, just as Judaism's grown, just as Islam has grown. Nothing is as it was. And even the Jews, even their writings will tell you that Moses did not understand everything like Akiva understood. They'll tell you that Akiva understood the Torah better than Moses did. And really, that's because a lot of tradition and writings have helped Akiva understand things that Moses maybe never was most supposed to understand, that Judaism's not even the same, just maybe. So I want to go now to this interview. And share screen. We're going to go to this, and we're going to go to share sound. Okay. Share. And here we go.
If I could perhaps come to a question that arises from a comment you made, a fascinating comment I think you made towards the end of the 4th chapter in your book, Paul and Jesus, which really struck me. And again, it kind of bears witness to your wordsmith ability, very well written. You say, if we can resist making assumptions and pick up Paul's letters, and Paul, of course, is the author of many, many letters in the New Testament, if we can pick up his letters with fresh eyes, we will capture an amazing moment in time for which he is our only first-hand source. We will learn how Paul transformed the original Christianity into a new religion that claimed to abrogate and supersede the old by moving everything from earth to heaven. Now, that's an extraordinary statement. Would you mind just unpacking that a bit, both in Paul's role in changing this original Christianity and how he moved everything from this terrestrial plane to the heavenlies?
Yes. Let me start with just the idea. There's a chapter that relates to this in the book called, I don't know if I use this title, but it's about reading the New Testament backwards. And the idea would be that instead of opening up, as most readers do, probably start with Matthew if they don't have any other guidance, even though most of us think Mark was first. But you have the impression that you're reading the beginning, the beginning of the movement, John the Baptist and Jesus, and if you do Luke or Matthew, the birth of Jesus. And then you're just going along. And because Luke also has Acts, then you get the history of the church. And as you well know, it should probably be called the Acts of Paul and a couple of things about the apostles rather than the Acts of the Apostles. Yes. So Paul immediately comes on the scene as the main force. And then you go into Paul's letters, Romans and so forth. And Romans hits you first, and that's a treatise in a very developed way, probably Paul's most mature theological presentation of his gospel, as he calls it. And you have the idea that you're just following along chronologically. And so what I try to emphasize, and remember, this is for general readers, I think my colleagues are well aware of this, but my students certainly aren't, is it's better to think, what do we first know about the movement? What's the earliest thing that we know? And that would be Paul's letter to, we call it Thessalonians, the little cell group, the little Christian group at Thessalonica. And that would be our first glimpse. And then we can go on through Paul's letters. There are 13 letters with Paul's name. Most scholars limit their serious consideration of Paul, let's call it the core Paul, to 7 of those letters. So the Corinthian correspondence, Philippians, even Philemon gets in, the one page to the slave owner, Onesimus, and so forth. So the idea of that statement is that we're capturing something in the letters that is actually earlier and more formative in terms of the movement, as far as a witness, so that when we come to the Gospels, it could well be, and I try to argue this, that the theology we're getting, the dominant theology that we're getting in Mark certainly and in Luke, to some degree paralleled in John, in Matthew is a kind of derivative of Mark, is very much a version of Paul. And so to get back at John the Baptist or Jesus.
Hey, pastors, ministers, fellow Christian brothers and sisters, how big of a stage do you want to be on? What kind of...
We have to do this thing that we scholars have been talking about now, 150 years, the so-called quest for the historical Jesus. What was Jesus of Nazareth as a human being actually like before Paul came along? Before Jesus became the Christ, as Paul calls him. And so the fresh eyes that I want people to have is actually we're very privileged to have these 7 letters. Most of us think they're very few interpolations, if any. We're actually getting something firsthand. So if you want to study religious experience, you want to study testimony, sometimes people say, well, what do you know about James? Well, I know we're going to talk about that, the brother of Jesus. Paul's our best witness because he actually says, I went and saw him and I visited him. So imagine you're reading a letter by someone who actually met James, and he gives you firsthand testimony. Not that he tells us enough, we wish we had more, but by putting things together, we begin to form a picture. So that statement is an attempt to say that the movement as it originally started was on earth, not in heaven. As the prayer Jesus taught his disciples says, let your will be done on earth, not in heaven, or as it is in heaven, rather. It was coming very much out of the Hebrew prophets, particularly Isaiah 2, Isaiah 11, these messianic prophecies about the last days, when the mountain of the Lord's house will be established, all the nations will flow to it. The nations will learn the one God, Yahweh or Jehovah, and turn and be taught the Torah and so forth. Paul certainly believed those texts and sometimes even alludes to them, but he has a more, I would argue, a more heavenly version of those texts. He's allegorizing them, as he clearly says sometimes, like in Galatians. He said, well, Jerusalem above is what we're interested in, not Jerusalem below.
So we see here the example of what I'm talking about, of how Paul went from the earthly realm to the heavenly realm. Yeah, we know that Jesus, the historical person, if there was one, would have been a normative, if he was a rabbi, a teacher, which we wouldn't have called them rabbis at the time, they've been just teachers of the Torah. He would have backed everything from the Hebrew scripture. But Paul saw something more within a unification, a universal picture of this thing, a heavenly drawing, more of like what we believe a lot of the spiritual people believe today. And the Hellenists, Plato, all these people, that I don't want to use the word Gnostic because it gets a bad thought people's cross sometimes, but it was more of a Gnostic understanding of the Christos, or in Kabbalah, the divine image within you, that this world is just nothing but a test. This world is a place that you come to bring out that goodness, that divine within you. And even Paul made this comment. He says that the feast and all of these things were nothing examples to show you the more heaven. In other words, they were signs that it wasn't really important to follow these things as they were written, in the flesh, but that they bring out the spiritual elements within your life. So Paul was teaching more, according to James Tabor and other people out there, much more from a spiritual heaven above than the earth view. And if you think about it, Kabbalists are the same way today. If you take anything, I do recommend Billy Phillips's the redacted words of Jesus, or I can't think of the name of it. It's kind of expensive, but you actually learn that even the great Kabbalists were using things of this world, the text of today, to illustrate and to give you examples of something greater, that it's not just about the here and there, that it's about a spiritual element. And Kabbalists, they spiritualize everything too, that Israel is not just the nation Israel, it's those who choose to follow the Creator, that it's not, even Paul said this, that all Israel is not Israel. So that's what I wanted to bring up today, is when you start looking and start studying different things within Scripture or dogma or arguments, you cannot just take the perspective of the modern understanding that we have today, because it don't hold up no more. So I hope this helps today, that as you're studying and reading different people, as you're reading things on religion, that you have to do more than just read a book or watch a couple of YouTube videos. You really have to dig and tear apart doctrines to really understand where they're really coming from. So I hope this helps. I hope you have a good day. And until next time, have a great day. Thank you so much.